love Miley. We're very connected, and we sing great together.
Yes.
She's so sweet, and I think she's so gifted, and I just am very proud of her.
It's August 25th, 2026, and the news drops that Dolly Parton has passed away at 80 after a brief, brutal battle with cancer. Within literal minutes, not hours, minutes, Miley Cyrus is already on X, and she is not holding back. If you've been anywhere near the internet in the last 24 hours, you already know the world lost Dolly Parton. But here's the part nobody's talking about. What happened the second Miley Cyrus heard the news? No press conference, no publicist, just Miley, her phone, and words that broke a whole lot of hearts. Grab a seat, because this one's personal. Miley's first words. Miley wasn't the only one mourning Dolly. Tributes poured in from across entertainment. Elton John called her a giant with a kind heart, while Dionne Warwick remembered her laughter and friendship. Reba McEntire called her "my buddy Dolly," and Casey Musgraves said the world felt a lot less sparkly. Paul McCartney praised Dolly's music, energy, and philanthropy. Lily Tomlin posted, "No words," while J.K. Rowling highlighted her imagination library. Flags were lowered nationwide, and the Empire State Building glowed pink. Yet Miley's tribute felt different. Elton knew Dolly as a legend. Paul knew her as an artist. Reba knew her as a friend. Miley knew her as her godmother. And apparently, fans knew exactly what that meant too. As the news spread across social media, some of the comments weren't even about Dolly's career or her legacy. People were saying things like, "Someone check on Miley," because everybody knew. They knew Dolly wasn't just another celebrity in Miley Cyrus's life. She was her godmother, her mentor, and someone who had been part of her world since before Miley was even born. And then Miley spoke. Her first post? Raw. She wrote that she couldn't believe the world had just lost the purest soul, told Dolly to rest in glory, and said her heart flat out aches. And she wasn't done. A second post followed where she said Dolly transcended time and that she lives on in the hearts of entire generations. Now here's why this hits different. This wasn't Miley simply acknowledging the death of a legendary performer. Her words came from someone who had known Dolly personally for decades. Someone who had grown up with her in her life. Someone who had shared a television screen with her, shared a stage with her, and eventually shared one of her most iconic songs with her. There was no need for a long explanation. Miley was grieving. And honestly, if you know anything about who Dolly actually was to Miley, this reaction makes a lot more sense than you'd think. Because Dolly wasn't just some collaborator or industry friend to Miley. She had been there from the very beginning. So who exactly was Dolly Parton to Miley Cyrus? And why does this loss cut so much deeper than a typical celebrity tribute? The godmother nobody saw coming. Here's where it gets good, because this story starts before Miley Cyrus was even Miley Cyrus. Like, before she was famous, before Hannah Montana, before the red carpets, before the tabloids, before any of it. Rewind to the early 1990s. Billy Ray Cyrus was riding high on the success of Achy Breaky Heart, and his career had put him in the same circles as one of country music's biggest stars, Dolly Parton. The two became friends, and their connection went beyond simply being musicians from the same part of the country. Dolly later explained that Billy Ray was a Kentucky boy while she was from Tennessee, and that shared Southern background helped create a natural connection between them. She knew him, trusted him, and eventually became close enough to his family that Billy Ray asked her to take on a very special role. When Billy Ray and Tish were expecting their daughter in 1992, he asked Dolly to be her godmother, and Dolly said yes. Just like that. That baby girl was Miley Cyrus. Dolly later described herself as Miley's honorary or fairy godmother, and she has repeatedly spoken about knowing Miley since before she was even born. In a 2023 interview with Howard Stern, Parton explained how her friendship with Billy Ray eventually led to that godmother relationship, and said, They had simply remained very close through the years. And that is one of those Hollywood details that sounds almost too perfect to be real. The legendary country star becomes the godmother of a future pop superstar. Except this wasn't a movie. It actually happened. And Dolly didn't just disappear after agreeing to the role. She remained part of Miley's life as Miley grew up. In fact, Dolly has described Miley in incredibly affectionate terms over the years, calling her a sweetheart and praising not just her talent, but the person she became. That's important, because Dolly wasn't someone who needed another famous person attached to her name. She already had everything. She had the career, the awards, the businesses, the songs, the movies, the theme park, the philanthropy, the cultural legacy. So when she invested time and affection into Miley, it wasn't because Miley could do something for Dolly. If anything, it was the other way around. Dolly was already Dolly, and Miley was just a little girl. That makes the relationship feel less like a strategic Hollywood connection and more like what it actually was. An older woman who genuinely cared about a young girl and continued to be there as that girl grew into adulthood. And that kind of relationship becomes even more significant when you remember the environment Miley was growing up in. She wasn't raised in a normal household where she could simply go to school, come home, and figure out who she wanted to be without millions of people watching. Her father was already a recognizable country star, and by the time Miley's own career took off, she was being introduced to fame at an age when most kids were still worrying about homework and school dances. That is a lot for anybody to navigate, especially a child. So having someone like Dolly in her life gave Miley access to something incredibly valuable: perspective. Dolly had already lived through the pressures of becoming famous young, reinventing herself, dealing with public expectations, and learning how to protect the person underneath the celebrity image. She knew that success could open doors, but she also knew that fame came with a price. And Dolly wasn't exactly known for being shy about giving advice. Over the years, she repeatedly encouraged Miley to stay true to herself and reminded people that there was much more to Miley than whatever headline happened to be circulating at the time. Dolly seemed to understand something that a lot of people watching from the outside didn't. Miley was going to have to figure herself out publicly. There would be mistakes. There would be reinventions. There would be moments when people didn't understand her choices. And through all of that, Dolly remained remarkably consistent in how she spoke about her. She didn't treat Miley like a project that needed fixing. She treated her like a person who was growing up. That distinction may sound small, but when you're growing up under a microscope, having even one person who sees the human being instead of the headline can mean everything. And for Miley, that person happened to be one of the most beloved women in music history. And there's another layer to all of this that makes the story even stranger, because years later, Miley and Dolly would discover that they weren't just chosen family. They were actually related. But before we get to that bombshell, we need to talk about the woman Miley was lucky enough to have in her corner. Where Dolly came from. Because you need this context. Dolly Parton didn't come from money, fame, privilege, or some fancy entertainment dynasty. She came from the mountains of East Tennessee. She was born into a large family and grew up in poverty, one of 12 children. Her childhood was spent in a tiny rural home with very limited resources, and by her own accounts, her family had to make do with whatever they had. We're talking about a childhood where basic comforts that many people take for granted simply weren't guaranteed. No glamorous Nashville upbringing, no industry connections, no safety net waiting for her. Just a little girl with a huge imagination and an even bigger dream. And somehow, she turned that into one of the most extraordinary careers in entertainment history. Dolly became a songwriter, singer, actress, producer, businesswoman, and philanthropist. She wrote thousands of songs, including some of the most recognizable compositions in modern music. She became a country superstar, crossed over into pop, conquered Hollywood, built Dollywood, and created charitable programs that reached millions of children. Her imagination library alone became a global literacy program, sending hundreds of millions of books to children. And that's why her relationship with Miley matters. Dolly's entire life was built around the idea that where you start doesn't have to determine where you end up. She knew what it felt like to be the kid nobody expected much from. She knew what it meant to dream bigger than your circumstances. And when Miley entered the entertainment industry at such a young age, Dolly was uniquely positioned to understand the strange world she was stepping into. Because Dolly had been famous for decades. She understood what the cameras could do, how quickly public opinion could turn. She understood the difference between being famous and actually having a life. And perhaps most importantly, she understood that fame could swallow a person whole if they forgot who they were underneath it. That makes Dolly's presence in Miley's life even more meaningful. Miley wasn't simply connected to one of the biggest stars in the world. She had someone in her corner who had already survived the machine. And Dolly never seemed particularly interested in turning Miley into another version of herself. Instead, she encouraged Miley to be Miley. That became especially obvious once Miley started building her own career. From Disney Channel to Jolene. Okay, so here's where their relationship gets really fun. Because their bond didn't stay behind closed doors, it played out on television, in music, on stages, and in front of millions of people. Remember Hannah Montana? Remember Aunt Dolly? Yeah, Dolly Parton appeared on Hannah Montana as Miley Stewart's godmother. And when you know the real-life story, the whole thing becomes almost hilarious. The writers weren't exactly inventing a random celebrity relationship. They basically took Miley's real life and turned it into a Disney Channel storyline. Dolly became Aunt Dolly on the show, and an entire generation of viewers watched her interact with Miley without necessarily realizing just how close the two actually were, outside the fictional world. For kids watching at home, it was simply another hilarious Hannah Montana episode. But behind the scenes, this was Miley literally working with the woman who had been her godmother since infancy. And that relationship only became more visible as Miley got older. Dolly wasn't just somebody from Miley's childhood anymore. She became part of Miley's musical evolution too. In 2023, Miley released her album Endless Summer Vacation. And although Dolly wasn't part of that album's original central concept, their musical relationship had already become a defining part of Miley's public identity. Then came Miley's rock project, Rockstar, where she recorded a new version of Dolly's legendary song, Jolene. And Dolly herself appeared on the recording. Think about how full circle that is. A goddaughter takes one of her godmother's most iconic songs and puts her own spin on it, while the original artist is right there lending her voice to the project. That's not just a celebrity collaboration. That's history repeating itself in the sweetest possible way. And their collaborations weren't limited to the studio. The two performed together publicly, including their memorable New Year's Eve appearance, and their chemistry was obvious. Miley has spoken about the connection she feels with Dolly, describing their relationship as having a real chemistry, love, and connection. Ancestry also noted that Miley had described Dolly as being like a mother to her, while Dolly described Miley as feeling like a daughter or sister. And you could see that affection whenever they appeared together. There was no awkward celebrity distance, no legend meets younger star stiffness. They joked, they teased each other, they laughed, they looked comfortable, like family, which, as it turns out, was actually more accurate than anybody realized, because in 2024, the family tree delivered one of the wildest plot twists imaginable. The twist nobody expected. So get this. In 2024, Ancestry revealed that Miley Cyrus and Dolly Parton weren't just chosen family. They were actually distant blood relatives, seventh cousins once removed. Yes, really. According to Ancestry's research, The two share a common ancestor named John Brickey, who was born in Virginia in 1740 and later moved to Tennessee. He was identified as Dolly's 6th great-grandfather and Miley's 7th great-grandfather. And Dolly's reaction when she found out? Basically, she was shocked, but not completely surprised, because she already felt like Miley was family. In an interview after learning about the genealogy discovery, Dolly joked that she would have assumed they were much closer relatives because of how close they already were. She said Miley felt like family anyway. And honestly, that is what makes this detail so much more fascinating. The blood connection didn't create their relationship. It came after the relationship already existed. Dolly didn't become Miley's godmother because they were related. She became Miley's godmother because she loved her family and had a genuine friendship with Billy Ray. They built the bond first. The genealogy just came along later and connected the dots. That is almost too perfect. And it also explains why Miley's relationship with Dolly never felt like a typical celebrity mentorship. There was history there. There was familiarity. There was a level of comfort that you can't really manufacture. Miley grew up with Dolly around her. Dolly watched Miley become famous. They worked together. They performed together. They appeared on television together. They supported each other publicly. And eventually, they discovered that their family trees were connected too. So when you put all of that together, Miley's reaction to Dolly's death becomes much easier to understand. This wasn't simply a pop star paying tribute to a country legend. This was Miley losing someone who had been woven into her life since before she could even remember. And that is why the phrase, "the purest soul," hits differently. Because Miley wasn't just talking about Dolly's career, she was talking about Dolly the person, the woman who had known her since infancy, the woman she had called a godmother, the woman who had appeared on her childhood television show, the woman she had shared music with, the woman who had encouraged her as an artist. And, in one of those strange twists life sometimes throws at you, the woman who turned out to actually be family by blood. What Dolly left behind. And perhaps that's the bigger story here, because Dolly Parton's legacy isn't just a list of awards and record sales. It isn't just Jolene. It isn't just 9 to 5. It isn't just I Will Always Love You. It isn't even just the wigs, rhinestones, and larger-than-life personality. Dolly's real legacy is the number of people who can point to her and say, "She made me feel seen." For Miley, that relationship was intensely personal. But it was also part of something Dolly did throughout her entire life. She made people feel like they mattered. She had this unusual ability to be one of the biggest celebrities in the world while still presenting herself as someone who remembered what it was like to start with nothing. That's why her death has hit so many different generations at once. Older fans knew Dolly from country radio. Their children knew her from movies and television. A younger generation discovered her through collaborations with contemporary artists. And people who didn't even necessarily listen to country music knew her because Dolly had become something bigger than a genre. She became an institution. And now that institution is gone. But the people she touched remain. Miley is one of them. And perhaps that's why her tribute feels so important. Because when somebody as famous as Miley Cyrus says her heart aches after losing Dolly, we're not just watching a celebrity mourn another celebrity. We're watching a daughter-like figure say goodbye to a woman who helped shape her life. And that makes the loss feel different. Dolly spent decades becoming a legend. But to Miley, she was still Dolly. The godmother, the mentor, the family friend. The woman who could walk onto the set of Hannah Montana and somehow make everything feel a little more familiar. The person who could stand beside Miley on a stage and make the whole thing feel effortless. And now suddenly, she's gone. Dolly Parton's legacy was never just about the music, the wigs, or the rhinestones. It was about the people she quietly, fiercely loved for decades. Miley Cyrus was very much one of those people. From becoming Miley's godmother before she was even born, to appearing as Aunt Dolly on Hannah Montana, to recording music together, performing together, and eventually discovering that they were distant blood relatives. Their story was one of those rare Hollywood relationships that somehow managed to feel genuinely human. And maybe that's why Miley's first reaction to Dolly's death hit so hard. Because beneath the superstar, beneath the cameras, beneath the millions of followers, there was simply a woman grieving someone who had been part of her life for decades. Dolly Parton may have belonged to the world, but to Miley, she was family. And that is something no award, chart position, or record sale could ever measure. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us to research it, hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into the real stories behind the headlines, and drop a comment telling us your favorite Dolly Parton memory. Rest in glory, Dolly. You'll be sorely missed.